All that in the next hour, and with us for the whole of the programme today is the Foreign Affairs analyst Tim Marshall. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Joe.
First of all today, Theresa May will host a meeting at the UN General Assembly today with internet giants Facebook, Microsoft and Twitter. She wants them to adopt a large of 1 to 2 hours to take down terrorist content wherever it appears. Internet companies will be given a month to show they are taking the problem seriously, with ministers at a G7 meeting in October due to decide whether enough progress has been made. Tim Marshall, first of all, is this a good idea?
Yes, it's an idea that is unfortunately necessary. The opposition against it is various things, privacy or sledge nut with a peanut, but there is an argument against it. Well, you wouldn't prosecute the maker of the pen or the paper that wrote a letter, or the post office for sending the letter. But that's an outdated idea. They only sent the letter to one person. On the internet, you're sending a message to tens of thousands of people simultaneously. Secondly, the tech companies are hiding behind that they are hosts. They are not publishers. Because nobody would expect the Times newspaper or the BBC as publishers to propagate teaching people how to build a bomb. So the tech companies say, well, we're just hosts. Well, this is semantics. They are publishers and they are publishing inflammatory material.
Right, and a level of compulsion here with what sort of sanction if they don't?
Well, that's the difficult bit. I mean, there are the vague talks about taxation because some of the big ones don't pay very much tax, but you need to have one tax law for all companies. You can't start picking and choosing. So they might have to go through Parliament with legislation that if your domain is within the UK, and this is the problem with the internet because it crosses all the borders.
Absolutely.
If you don't take this down, we are going to come after you legally. I mean, I think she's walking into an extremely complicated legal minefield, but that's not to say that in 2017, with what happened last week and for the 5th time this year, something like this is not required.
Thank you. I mean, do you think this could be, even talking about 20 billion euros, the thing that does unlock these negotiations?
It's a step towards unlocking it. There's two wars going on. There's a phony war and the real war. The real war at the moment is in the UK in two fronts. One, people trying to get the UK not to leave whatsoever. The other real war in the UK is pretty much within the government. OK, are we going to have a hard or a soft Brexit? All this is so that the British can get their ducks in a row on Friday and moving into the autumn, that, OK, this is our direction. And my honourable friend, has pretty much admitted that we will pay something. It's just to be negotiated. Second part, I played this game with a French diplomat at the beginning of the summer. She started on 100 billion. I said, I'm walking away from the table. She came down to 80. I said, come on. I came in with 20. And we agreed to negotiate further when we agreed between 30 and 50, which is where I think it's going to go. Last bit, the phony war is at the moment in Europe. They are not going to do anything until Mrs. Merkel is re-elected this weekend. Only after that will they start to concentrate. When the Germans start to concentrate, the French will concentrate. They will both concentrate, and then the power that the Commission has to slap the UK around will diminish, and Britain will start talking in back channels to the capitals. So we're having our real war now. The phony war in Europe is about to end, and that it's all going to start for real in the autumn. Which
was always the prediction, wasn't it? Until Angela Merkel was either re-elected or not, they weren't going to get serious. Well,
when I read that Mr. Johnson said that, what was it, they were singing
birds.
Nest of singing birds.
I thought the cabinet was singing like canaries, actually, to different people all the time on the different briefings.
Well, it was an odd metaphor.
Which is what the whole thing is about.
I think.
This is about the manoeuvres for the future, and it's pretty plain, and we're allowed to say it, and some people aren't.
Right. It is difficult, though, isn't it, for Theresa May to, in her position as she is now, at the head of a minority government, to have to tread these two, if you like, strands of thought. One which thinks we should stay a bit closer aligned to the EU, and the other says we should break altogether.
Because when the European phony war ends, which is pretty soon, the United Kingdom really has to have a united front in its negotiations. Because if it goes in there split asunder, it's playing from a weaker position, which is why at some point the Conservatives usually do come together, even on Europe, And so we are in this transitional period, which is pretty close to ending. I think.
So everything's going to be done at the last minute, isn't it, like everything else in
Well,
Europe?
you know the three-shirter thing? When it comes to the one-day conference to sign, take 3 shirts.
Well, you heard it here first or second. Now, you've heard of Article 50, the one Theresa May triggered in March, but what about another EU treaty article, Article 127? That's not been triggered, but some MPs think it needs to be. Now, as well as being a member of the EU, the UK is currently part of the European Economic Area, which has been signed by countries within the single market. Its members include all EU countries, plus Iceland, Norway and Liechtenstein. Article 127 of the EEA agreement states that countries must give 12 months' notice before leaving the single market. Bear with me. So, does the UK need to also give notice to leave the EEA? If so, this could mean the government would have to seek the consent of Parliament before signalling Britain's departure, just as the Supreme Court ruled it had to before triggering Article 50. Ministers say Article 127 does not apply and that the EEA agreement will automatically cease to apply to the UK after Brexit. Brexit Secretary David Davis told MPs earlier this month that the article didn't need to be triggered for the UK to leave the EEA, but he did say ministers were looking at it just to make sure. If Article 127 did need to be invoked, it could require a vote to take place in Parliament by March 1918. And with a slender Commons majority and no Conservative majority in the House of Lords, that could present a tricky obstacle for Theresa May. And that seemed to be what the Labour manifesto said at the time. I mean, Tim, looking at this from the outside, I mean, a judicial review has been rejected, actually, by the courts. So does
Joe, it was only because it was deemed to be premature, because the decision wasn't deemed to have been taken by government.
Right, but it was rejected at that point,
it was
wasn't
deemed
it?
to be premature, but they didn't test the merits of the argument on either side.
Well, then could there be an attempt to have another go through the legal system, I mean, in a Gina Miller style?
Which is why, Heidi, if you permit me, mentioned the dreaded L word, law. That's where it's going. It's heading towards the courts, same as last time. Look, I'm in a minority of one in this country. I'm relaxed about leaving and I'm relaxed about staying. I don't think the world's going to collapse, whichever it's going to be. But I was with Mr. Blair last week, actually, at a conference, and he was saying there are ways of means of staying,
Absolutely.
and this is one of the ways. I'm not saying that's why you're taking it. No. So where it's going to go, almost certainly, Mr. Davis can trigger 127. At that point, he can be challenged and it can go to the court. It will turn on the interpretation of exactly what you've just been reading out from memory, which is you can either interpret the law that when we joined the EU and in 93 the single market, when they come together, when we leave that, we are leaving both of them. Or, my learned friends, ka-ching, for weeks on end.
I can see you're a big fan of lawyers, yeah.
You can do it the other way. No, my interpretation is that yes, Article 50 is triggered, that's fine, but you also must trigger, and that has to go to Parliament. If a court was to rule that, it will go to Parliament, and then who knows which they will.
Well, and on that tantalising end comment, we will finish the discussion.
It seems quite likely.
But nothing else was actually making North Korea sort of move back from the brink. And in a way, was this not more about putting pressure on China, who are seen as key in terms of influencing North Korea?
It was two different punches. The punch was, which of course got the headlines, is threatening to destroy North Korea, which is very, very clumsy. He should have said the North Korean regime. I mean, he did say that in the second time he said it, but he actually said destroy North Korea as opposed to the North Korean regime. That was very clumsy, I thought. If you strip out the Trumpisms, I think this was a pretty basic foreign policy speech by someone that would be in the realist camp. The thing to China was the thing which is equally important, and that was the end bit of the clip you played, and that was, he said, pretty much, we are committed to going through the United Nations. So he's warning what will happen if that process ends, but he's still going through the United Nations. And as I said, you strip out the Trumpisms, you strip out that clumsy phrase about destroying, incredibly clumsy phrase, and this was actually a fairly mainstream speech.
Right. Well, you say clumsy. Of course, people were terrified and will say that they were very frightened by the words that were used. But he is there at the United Nations, as we've all obviously observed. Is the pressure on China going to work?
I think China has a very different set of calculations. It's very worried about the regime collapsing, about the humanitarian refugee crisis.
Because it'll all end up on
what
that.
will happen to the nuclear weapons that are there. And so I think that the calculation is very different. But I don't think this was actually a very realist speech. Despite the focus on sovereignty, we still see condemnation of what's going on internally in countries. Think about what he said about Venezuela, condemning them for being
Mr. Obama
socialist.
used to say that every year.
Well,
there were plenty of things he said that Mr. Obama could and did say.
Which isn't to say that it's necessarily realist. So he wants to develop this notion of, I think it's principled realism. It's very unclear what this is. But he's trying to have it both ways, Trump, without, sovereignty, but actually let's talk about regime change in Venezuela, in Cuba, and in Iran, right? The language on Iran, and what's going on internally in Iran was
There were echoes of the Axis of Evil speech.
Yes, I mean, I think there were people feel that it was a bit certainly reminiscent of the Axis of Evil speech. So he wouldn't be the first, if you like, in that sense. Was this an attempt to have a coherent, if you like, foreign policy?
I think there's not a lot of coherence coming out of the White House, certainly not in this particular speech. So no, I wouldn't put this as coherent. He's consistent right now in what he's pushing when it comes to North Korea, but a coherent sort of overall strategic response from the United States, not so much.
Well, on Iran, because the hints obviously of tearing up that deal, which Boris Johnson, funnily enough, the Foreign Secretary, would say would be very detrimental. But it was something that he said during the campaign, wasn't it?
But it's also something that is not unilateral. It was 6+1. There's 7 countries involved in the Iran deal, and I don't think he can just tear it up, nor do I think he will. I think the North Korea stuff is by far the more imminent and bigger issue with which he has to deal. Briefly, what we are, if you look at the time in Pyongyang, it is something to midnight. We don't know what to midnight it is, but it's something. And every time something happens, a speech like that or a missile launch, there's another tick. Midnight is a nuclear-armed North Korea or a completely destroyed North Korea with a preemptive strike, or very unlikely, North Korea that's been rewarded just to tell us it's shut down its nuclear program without weapons inspectors going to check, because they wouldn't allow that. So I think it's only A or B. Midnight is either a nuclear-armed North Korea or North Korea destroyed. And every single time we talk about this, we are one tick closer to midnight.
Well, North Korea is a nuclear state, and we've already entered a situation where it's about containment and deterrence. The idea of a preventive strike on North Korea that wouldn't cause tremendous devastation for America, for South Korea, for everybody, seems tremendously unlikely.
Thank goodness. Leslie Vinjamuri, thank you for coming in. Now, Donald Trump also used his speech at the General Assembly yesterday to have a dig at his hosts. He's been a long-time critic of the United Nations, and it's not just the green marble that decorates the building that he dislikes, nor is he the organisation's only critic. Here's Elizabeth Glinker.
Westminster's Central Hall, decked with the flags of 51 nations, is chosen to house the Assembly.
The first ever meeting of the United Nations General Assembly was held here at Methodist Central Hall in London in 1946. The Swedish diplomat Dag Hammarskjöld, who would later become Secretary General of the UN, said it was created not to lead mankind to heaven, but to protect humanity from hell. In a world ripped apart by war, scarred by genocide, that hell was easy to imagine. But strangled by competing political agendas and weighed down by bureaucracy, is it still the best way to save humanity from itself?
When the world holds a mirror up to itself, what it sees is the UN. The UN is a microcosm of a problematic world. It reflects the lack of trust between major countries. It reflects the fragmentation of a sort of any kind of global political order. Despite all of that, massive global problems do get fixed at the UN.
Agreements on climate change and poverty, UNICEF programmes which have educated millions of children, missions to protect civilians in Kosovo, Sierra Leone and Congo. In 70 years, much has been achieved, but there have been notable failures, most recently, of course, in Syria.
I think if you look at specific situations, Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, the failure to hold governments to account for their actions, I think, has cost lives.
And beyond that most serious of failings, some, including the President of the United States, have questioned the UN's political interventions and the makeup of its many committees.
Too often the focus of this organization has not been on results, but on bureaucracy and process. In some cases, states that seek to subvert this institution's noble aims have hijacked the very systems that are supposed to advance them.
Governments in the West may see it as bloated and inefficient, but in developing countries, it's often seen as undemocratic and dominated by the rich.
One of the reasons that the peace and security agenda, the whole political agenda of the United Nations, has not necessarily been as successful as we would like to see, is precisely because there's a feeling that there isn't total commitment behind it.
In many places, UN workers, humanitarian workers, peacekeepers, diplomats, mediators, are working night and day to try and take the edge off these conflicts, steer them to some kind of conclusion and transition to better government. And, this is God's work, done in extraordinarily difficult conditions all over the world.
Tim Marshall, you a defender of the United Nations and the point of it?
Very much. Although it is a corrupt organisation which is riven with lazy careerists. However, that said, the best point there was made by Mr. Malloch Brown. We tend to look at the Security Council and sometimes it just gets bogged down and locked and people block each other and we think it's a failure, it's a talking shop. But what about all the other great work it does all over the world, both in peacekeeping missions, keeping people apart, feeding people, disaster zones, you name it, and as a forum? It's discredited sometimes in things like its Human Rights Council, which was headed by Gaddafi's Libya at one point.
Right. So people might find that ironic.
Completely flawed, but if you didn't have one, you'd have to make one.
And on that point, we'll leave it now.
Our destiny lies in Europe.
I was a diplomatic correspondent at the time of the Bruges speech, and we all knew that this was a big speech. We saw it in the context of British politics, big speech, fighting. I don't think we were aware at the time of just how significant it was and its longevity. I don't get that feeling about Mrs May's speech.
You don't think it will have that sort of impact?
No, because I agree that I think she'll set out a direction of travel, but I still think it's too early. But it'll be the direction of travel. And the mood music is important, as you know, but I can't see the Florence speech being a Bruges speech.
Do you agree with that? Because, of course, as we know from history, the Bruges speech did lead to a split, or you say existed anyway, but a further split in the Conservative Party. And, of course, we had Geoffrey Howe's resignation a few years later. Do you agree with Tim that this won't have the same impact?
Yes, I certainly agree with that. I don't think it can possibly have the same impact. Though, of course, it could destabilise the government if the Prime Minister chose to go for broke and say the things she really wants to say, and I have no idea what they are, but if she says them, she might provoke one or two of her colleagues to jump and leave the government. So it could have a short-term political impact, there's no doubt about that. But I doubt it's going to. So I think my point is that I think the situation is ripe for that.
And when you say she could go for broke, what do you mean?
Well, set out either a hard Brexit, really hard Brexit case, in which case some of the Remainers, I think, would find it hard to stay in the cabinet, or she could go the other way and set out the Remain case, and some of the Brexiteers would jump. That was never going to be the case with the Bruges speech. This was an attempt to set out a whole new vision for Europe going forward, and it was almost philosophical in its way.
What do you make then of the cabinet machinations at the moment and what is happening in the build-up to this speech in Florence?
Well, quite clearly there are unresolved differences. I mean, I don't think that's a good thing, but they clearly exist. I have to say that I thought Boris Johnson's intervention was clearly a preemptive strike to get his side of the argument on the record, make it harder for the Prime Minister not to go along with a good part of that. It's not a very good way to run a government, I'm afraid, especially when the national interest is so much at stake as it is now. But it's a reflection of the mistake of holding the election, the even bigger mistake of not winning the election outright. We are where we are. And I doubt that we are ready yet to set out the definitive position that Britain will adopt as we go into the final phase of Brexit.
So you think that's been postponed, that's been delayed by this intervention, which in your mind didn't work?
Well, we can't know if it'll work until we see what actually happens. And that's going to still take, after all, there's 48 hours still to go. And I've known many prime ministerial speeches which were not complete until an hour before they were
delivered. Very long time in politics.
It is a very long, well, it certainly is in the last few years, that's for sure. I mean, Margaret Thatcher always had a reputation for taking a tough line, yes, and her tone was pretty no-nonsense. What kind of tone do you think Theresa May should adopt, bearing in mind, as you said, she's making this speech from an EU capital, sorry, not a capital, but a city like Florence?
I would expect it to be a conciliatory tone. I think it would be, as I said earlier, setting out the many advantages that even outside the EU we can bring to Europe. All the cooperation on the defence side, where we're stronger than anyone else, on the counter-terrorism, on many other areas of government policy. After all, it seems to me, actually, in a way, one reason for choosing Florence is it's a great reminder, given its history and the enormous culture, there's much more to Europe than the European Union.
And a beautiful place to go, of course.
Well, of course, no Prime Minister would ever go for frivolous reasons like that.
No, of course not, but I'm sure they'll enjoy it. Thank you very much for coming in. Pleasure. That's it for today. It's all we've got time for. Thank you to you for being our guest of the day and joining me here. The 1 o'clock news is starting over on BBC One now, and I'll be back again tomorrow at midday. Join me then. Bye.